Okay, sure. That's fine. All right, so first of all, I want to thank everyone for being here. It's 4 o'clock on the first day of the conference. That's a rough time slot, so I applaud all of you for being here. My name's Scott Baldwin. This is utilizing your resiliency program as an operational risk service provider today. And we're going to have a lot of fun. It doesn't sound like a fun topic, but trust me, we're going to have a lot of fun with this. So this is the agenda. And the one thing I want to really point out is the last thing, the Q&A. We do have a time here for questions and answers, but especially in a group this small, I love to have a more conversational approach to this. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, issues that you want to talk about within context, that's even better than waiting till the end. So just raise your hand and let's just talk it through. One thing though, MetricStream does expect me to get through the whole presentation. So if we're getting to a point where I feel like we may not be able to finish, I might have to bring us back to the deck, and I hope no one takes offense at that, but they do want me to complete it. So, all right, introductions. So, whoops. This isn't, okay, there we go. That's me, Scott Baldwin. I currently head up the Enterprise Resiliency Program at Symantec, and I've worked for a few other high-tech companies in the Bay Area. But I think what I think is most interesting about me is, at least in the Bay Area, I'm a native, which is very rare in San Jose. But what's kind of cool about that is I remember when Apple was 2 buildings. And before Silicon Valley was known as Silicon Valley. So, and of course, that's a picture. Does anyone know what that picture is? That's right. That's a spaceship building. That's 2 miles from my parents' house where I grew up. That incredibly increased the property value of my parents' house. But it's just amazing what's happened in Silicon Valley over my lifetime. And I think it kind of reflects on a global scale what's also happened. And that's kind of what I want to talk about. That kind of ties into the conversation today. So now, enough about me. Let's talk about you. So by a show of hands, who here is directly involved in business continuity? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. So out of the 4 people that just raised their hands, is that your primary role or is that a kind of an add-on role? Add-on? Anyone primarily do business continuity? But they kind of have to do it in addition to other things? Okay. What about disaster recovery? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Same deal, kind of an add-on thing? Okay. What about crisis management? Anyone involved in crisis management? Okay. Kind of the same people. We're getting the same crowd here. And then GRC? Okay. A lot of people. And I have other here. Anyone involved in something primarily that was not on this list? Raise your hand. Okay, in the back, what are you involved in?
In compliance, policy, and all that.
Okay. Okay, all right. And you, sir?
I am involved in testing, so I guess maybe I have a hand in all those different areas, but none of those are my primary role.
Huh. So what kind of like application testing or?
Application testing, service testing.
Ah, interesting. Okay. And you, sir?
I have digital forensics as well as
Okay. Well, thanks for that. Now, I've spoken at a lot of conferences in a lot of places, and it just occurred to me while I was preparing this, I've never spoken outside of a resiliency conference. So one of the primary things when you're speaking is to know your audience, and I realize that may not be the case here at all. So I want you to hopefully bear with me, and if I make some assumptions that are wrong, kind of steer me in the right direction. But I think the whole point of this presentation is kind of reflected in the fact that in the dozens and dozens of presentations I've given, I've never given one to a risk or GRC conference. This is all about integrating resiliency with risk, and yet this is the first time I'm presenting this outside of resiliency, so go figure. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about business continuity management, and I'm going to use the term BCM and resiliency kind of interchangeably. There is some differences, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but BCM is a smaller thing to write than resiliency. So BCM from a risk perspective. First of all, what is business continuity management? There are three major aspects of it: business continuity, disaster recovery, and crisis management. Does anyone know why disaster recovery is called disaster recovery? I mean, it's kind of weird. Business continuity, it makes sense, right? You want to continue the business. But then I always get my customers always say, well, where did the term disaster recovery come from? That's kind of weird, huh? Well, we'll get into that. We'll talk about that later. But so those are the three core pieces. Business continuity, obviously, is continuation of people, processes, locations. Disaster recovery is technology recovery, making sure that technology is up and running. Crisis management is the art of communication in chaos to manage the response process. Those are the three things that make up BCM. Now, this is kind of how I think risk sees us. So I'm looking at risk and then back at myself. I feel like risk thinks of resiliency or BCM as another operational risk area, much like privacy and cyber and whatever. They're always asking me questions that they would ask to another operational risk area. Of course, I see us more like this. I think we do not have a specific and unique area of risk that we focus on. We are concerned with anything that will disrupt the business. And typically, we fall into one of these four buckets. So loss of personnel, workspace, dependencies, or infrastructure. And if you think about it, almost any operational risk area has things associated with it that if they go wrong could impact one of those four things. So we kind of see ourselves as kind of not really an operational risk area. We're a little bit different. And that's how we see ourselves. These are the primary activities of BCM or resiliency. We do assessments or analysis. Then we build plans based on those assessments. We validate those plans. And then if anything does not work out with those plans, we mitigate whatever it is that wasn't working. And that's a life cycle. We do it over and over and over. That's all we do. We've gotten very good at doing this. We've done it for 30 years. If there's any tips and tricks to doing these, we figured it out. I'm kind of proud of this. Okay. So again, if there's any questions, comments, concerns, just raise your hand. So why am I even talking about this? Oh, let me just say, but I was talking to some of the risk people this morning, and I'm amazed that the very same concerns we have in resiliency, a lot of people in risk have as well. So I think even though I'm talking about resiliency, a lot of this, I think, if you put into your own areas, you might see some parallels, okay? So the issue is, this, I don't know, this didn't work very well. Okay. It's about return on investment. And I've heard several times this morning by talking to other people how in GRC and in risk, we need to find a way to provide more value for the investment that we are asking our company, our organizations to invest, right? So right now, there's a perception, or maybe it's real, that the return that we're giving does not balance out with the investment that we're asking to make. Does anyone feel this way in their risk areas, or is this just resiliency? Okay, it's just us. And a couple of people I talked to this morning. But if you look at something like this, there's only two ways to fix this. One is we reduce the investment, and the other is we increase the return. That's the only two ways we can do this. So within the resiliency community, there's a group of people who feel that we should reduce the investment. What they want to do is streamline everything, cut everything down to just capability of recovery. All this extra risk assessment stuff, the documentation, the risk identification, all that throw out the window. Just focus on recovery, okay? There's a second group that says, no, that's kind of like going to the dollar store and getting something you don't need because it's only $1. What they say is, let's provide something of value. This is where organizational resilience, that term, came from. It's a way to kind of differentiate themselves from traditional business continuity. And what they say is, let's do a holistic approach. Let's be risk-based. Let's look more at the whole framework of the company and try to integrate more with that. How they do that, they don't really know, but that's the idea. So we have these two competing concepts here. Man, I'm having a problem with that. So, all right, well, I'm having a lot of problem with this. But let's get back to why this is important. Is there somewhere I should be aiming this? I guess over here, maybe. There we go. That's the secret. All right, so why is this even a conversation at all? To answer that, I want to go back a little bit on the history of business continuity management, and it'll be real short. So, in the beginning, we had big computers. These computers used these big reel-to-reel magnetic tapes, or they used punch cards, and there were computer rooms. And we had these people called computer room technicians. And they did a lot of things with the punch cards, et cetera, but a couple things they did that are kind of related to current-day resiliency is they made sure the power was kept on. It's just, the other thing they did was made sure that it didn't overheat because these machines were very hot. There wasn't really much more to it than that until about 30 years ago, when the ability to back up the data via another machine and do that automated through a schedule. So automated network backing up became practical. Now all of a sudden, it was possible to back up the data. And so we had the birth of a new technology, or a new discipline, which basically was to recover, after a disaster, to recover the data. So that's where disaster recovery came from. They recovered data after a disaster. What they did was they backed up the data, they put it off-site somewhere safe, and if something happened, they brought it back and recovered the data. Now, there was no internet, really. I think the first internet site was 1991. So the failure of these machines did not result in a revenue loss. People were not using these machines to transact financial, like purchases or whatever. In fact, a lot of times these servers could be down between 24 hours and 2 weeks, and the public wouldn't even know they were down. It didn't affect people's ability to purchase because, frankly, people were still purchasing things over the phone, the cash register, through the mail. So this is where disaster recovery and thus business continuity management came from. However, we got the internet. Now, everything can be purchased 24/7. Well, not everything, but you get what I'm saying. Now it's a matter of a global marketplace. People are able to buy something, on Amazon, 2 o'clock in the morning. They have 2-day shipping. So there's all these operational components that need to be going on constantly, right? So the complexion of the environment has totally changed. Now, if a website's down, the customer is going to go to a different site. I'll go to eBay if Amazon's down. What's worse is even companies that don't really need to be up 24 hours a day, if they're not, they will suffer a reputational damage. It'll look bad. They'll go to a competitor because you can't keep your website up. It's become, it's gotten to the point where the idea of recovery is no longer attractive, because recovery means disruption. And disruption is just something that is become just not okay. Our kids expect things to be up all the time. So a huge shift has happened in the past 30 years. So having said that, we have this perception problem. Business continuity management and resiliency is still perceived to be this thing that recovers. It's like the guy with the broom that cleans up the glass after something breaks, right? That's how we're perceived. However, the expectations have changed. Now, it's expected we're completely 24/7 available, yet the perception of what we do is that we are fixing something that breaks. And that's why I think part of this angst that we're feeling as a community, as a discipline, is happening, because the return we're giving is not meeting the investment we're requiring. So, going back to this question of return on investment, the first one, streamline BCM and focus only on recovery capability. No, that's not going to work. Because even though we are reducing the cost, what we're giving is something that is just not attractive. That's not what people want anymore, is the recovery. It's just, even though it has to be there, it's not something that people want to think about. So that leaves us with number 2, broaden BCM's scope and move towards a risk-centric approach to organizational resilience. So we want to work within a risk framework, and we want to avoid impact, not recover from it. That's the new normal. So I think it's pretty clear where I stand on the whole balance of the ROI thing. All right, so what I've come up with is a framework that has 3 phases. And each of these phases can be, we can spend a lot of time on each one of these, but this is going to be a very high overview. The first one's compliance. Next is readiness, and the final one is resilience. And compliance focus on recovery. We have to focus on recovery. No matter what else you do, if you cannot recover, then you're in big trouble there. Next one is focuses on impact absorption, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And the final phase focuses on actually avoidance, risk identification, and impact avoidance. But to better kind of explain this, let's take an example outside of resiliency. Let's say that you are been put in charge of reducing the number of cardiac-related fatalities in your country. And you've been told, you know, this is what you got to do, how are you going to do it? Let's take this 3-phase approach and take a look at that. So, I hope I don't give anything away here. Okay. What's the first thing you might do to improve the survival rate from cardiac events?
Awareness.
What's that?
Awareness.
I'm sorry, who said that? Oh, awareness? That's a good one, but is that the first thing you would do? What's the if you want to get someone to survive a heart attack? Okay. Yes. Boy, this is tough. This is a risk group. You guys are all metric. This is simpler than that. Let me just do this. Maybe that'll help. Build a bunch of ambulance and ER strategically placed throughout the community. Let's say you can say, all right, we're going to get the victim, once we get a call, we're going to get the victim to the hospital within 12 minutes. That's going to improve the recovery rate of a cardiac event, right? How can we reduce that fatality rate even more? I'm just going to do it.
Better staff on the truck.
Better staff on the truck, that's true. That you want a world-class ER system, but what if we trained our public in CPR? We could have people addressing the issue within seconds. That would then even reduce the amount of fatalities even more, right? So now you've got people responding to cardiac events within seconds. Now, how can we even improve or decrease cardiac events even more? Yes?
You can start preventing it by giving out diet information such that you know what to do.
Bingo, that's right. Exactly. Thank you. So now we're doing something completely different. we're not responding anymore, we're being proactive. So now, even though this last phase is a totally different approach, doing that is going to save more lives than the first two combined. So that's kind of the same. I want to think about this as I talk about the resiliency approach. Because in the end, we don't want to recover, we want to be available. So it's better not to have a heart attack than to recover quickly from a heart attack, right? So, first phase is the compliance phase. Now, I call it compliance because these are all the things that a functional business continuity management program would have in place, and if an auditor came in, they would sign off on it. Those things are these activities I talked about before, having a BIA, having a business continuity plan, disaster recovery plan, validating all those activities on a sustainable basis. That's what compliance means. And we do that ostensibly to increase recovery. Okay, so how do we do it? Remember, in the medical example, we strategically placed ER and ambulance centers throughout the community. We do the same thing with this. We create resiliency centers throughout the organization. In the companies I work with, the size and complexity, usually the VP is the perfect level to install resiliency communities and or programs. And what I do is I tell the VP that they are now completely responsible for resiliency in their area. If something happens and they cannot recover appropriately, they will be held accountable. And then you know what their response is. They have a heart attack, right? They get all upset at me. They say, what that's your job, etc. They get all red in the face. And I say, wait a minute. Here's what we're going to do. If you can give me somebody who will speak and act on your behalf when it comes to resiliency, I guarantee you I will train that person and create a program within your group to be compliant. That's my guarantee to you. So what happens is that VP very quickly assigns me someone. Now that person is asking me for help. Like, I don't know how to do this. Can you help me do it? My VP has assigned me. So what we do is we give the risk responsibility to the executive, and then we create a resiliency program by identifying someone who could enact it, okay? And then what we do is we train, mentor, and support. We use a crawl, walk, run methodology. We go in, my team goes in and does the activities the first year, or at least part of the first year. And while we're doing it, we're spending extra effort on training this business resiliency manager, or BRM. So in this way, we're creating this capability in the business to handle the compliance level of the program. Now, what's the purpose? Obviously, the purpose is to create this capability, but really, we're giving ownership. So the cool thing about business continuity management are the activities we do are simple enough that within a few weeks, if I have a member of my staff who has some skill, within a couple weeks, they can train that person how to do the BIA, how to do the BCP, the DRP. And it's not impossible. It's actually very achievable to do. On the other hand, the learning curve is enough that there's a sense of, they feel good. They feel like they've done something. They have a completion, and they also have a differentiation between their colleagues because they now know something that their colleagues don't. So it's a great balance. There's enough work there, but it's not too much that it's too difficult. At the end of the day, when they are able to do all the activities, we give them a certification. I'm actually going off to Herndon after this to give this certification to one of my BRMs. And the great thing about that is I've guaranteed the VP that if they gave me someone, I would give them someone who could run their program. That right there is a tangible artifact that's it's like I'm giving them ownership of the program right there. Now everyone knows that they are capable and responsible for running that program. That's a really important aspect, the ownership. Sustainability is another important aspect because a lot of resiliency programs spend all their time from January to December, making sure their company's compliant. Then when January rolls around again, they do the same thing over, year after year after year. I've never seen, except some financial institutions that spend a lot of money, I've never seen an organization that is able to maintain that for more than 3 or 4 years. They usually, it falls apart. This way, we're able to get the business to manage that. Now, it took me 6 employees to get Symantec compliant. It takes me 1 employee to maintain that compliance. This person, their full-time job is once a month meeting with each of the BRMs for 30 minutes to just make sure that they're on top of things. It's a very easy lift once we get this program rolled out. So now, it's going to be sustainable. I built this at eBay, at Synopsys, and now at Symantec, and they're all running still. So it's a very robust program. And finally, scalability. We're going to actually be leveraging this same network of resiliency managers to do risk stuff later. So we're creating those relationships now that we can utilize later. So it's very important for scalability. Next step is readiness. And again, readiness was, I likened it to the CPR, getting the community out there. Now, we talked about something I call impact absorption. And I kind of made that up. I don't know, maybe it's a real term. But there's two, the obvious or the when we do readiness, what we're doing is we're doing functional exercises. So let's go here. So what we do is we do realistic functional exercises. Now, these are different than validation exercises. In validation exercises, we're making sure that the plans we create are accurate, complete, realistic, etc. Functional exercises are a little bit different. What we're trying to do here is create muscle memory. We're going to try to drill into these people their roles and responsibilities so they don't have to think about it. A lot of times, we find that people know what to do when something happens. Oh, yes?
Would this also, wouldn't a sense of agility also be relevant here?
Agility?
Flexibility?
Yes, absolutely. That's a good point because people know how to recover their departments and stuff. What they don't know is when to do it and when to step up and when to be agile. So this really creates this sense of agility and adaptability because people, they get comfortable with it. And so that is absolutely part of it. We want them to be more familiar with, who does what and when. But the second part of this is shifting the perspective. That's the next slide, but we're going to shift perspective. We're going to go away from recovery and into absorption. And I think that's really, the obvious reason is recovery, but the less obvious reason we're doing is for absorption. So operational impact absorption. Now, here's a really dumb example I just thought of a little while ago, but if I talk to you about making a can of soup in a pan, heating it up and eating it, if you've never done that before, you might think about the flavor of the soup or how long it takes to cook it or whatever, but probably a lot of you are not going to think about the handle of that pan being hot. And you might, when you first do it, burn your hand. That's what we talk about when we're talking about risk and impacts, and we're just talking about it. There's a lot of the things that go on that we're not going to think about. When we do it occasionally, when you cook soup at home, once a month or whatever, you might tap the handle because you've been burnt before. You might go down and get a towel or some kind of oven mitt, right? Or you might forget to and burn your hand. But if you're making soup every single day, you might go out and get a pan that has a rubber handle so that you don't burn your hand at all. That's kind of like the idea of impact absorption. We're going to change processes just enough because it's human nature that when we feel pain, we're going to change our behavior so that we don't feel that pain. Here's an example at eBay. eBay rolls out code changes every single day. They are constantly rolling out changes to the website. The QA team at eBay was not very good. And we would roll out lots of bugs. Every time they had a rollout, it would cause a huge issue, reputational damage, all kinds of stuff. It got to the point where the release management team, who were responsible for all of this, for making, rolling it back and all that, got to the point they got so good at rolling back code changes that it didn't faze them. As soon as they heard about a bug, boom, they pressed a button, it got rolled back. They sent it to QA and the engineering team. Like I said, it was so normal that they changed their operational procedures that it didn't even become an impact really anymore. Now, obviously, I think the QA team should do a better job, but without them doing that, that's an example of a group of people who got tired of the pain and they changed their operational procedures to address it. That's all we're talking about with impact absorption. We want to identify, so when we're doing these functional tests, we might say, what if this application was unavailable? And they do, their recovery strategies or whatnot. What would be awesome is we got to a point where they said, oh, we figured out a way to do it without that application. And it doesn't even become an impact. That's really, that way we don't have a disruption. We have the absorption of that incident. And then finally, resilience. So resilience, to me, is about the ability to identify risk and proactively mitigate it before we even have to deal with an impact. Again, it's just like diet and exercise. If we're taking care of the root causes, then we don't even have to worry about the result of what might happen. So there's two aspects of this. We go the top down and the bottom up. So what we do is we have this, and I have one of my senior managers, their role is it's called risk resiliency, and they just meet with other operational risk areas, and they explain we are trying to identify risk that could potentially interrupt the business. So we call our partner on the risk side a risk liaison. So they might be a cyber risk liaison, a privacy risk liaison, et cetera. And that person working with my senior manager will identify some controls that would most likely cause some kind of impact that might disrupt the business. So that's the first step. The second step is we go back to our network. We go back to these 30 years of activities that we have focused on recovery, and we broaden them to be resilience. So for example, and this is where I might get in some trouble with you guys, the BIA. We have trained, again, Moose here, he's certified. He knows how to do BIA. We don't need to hold his hand anymore. But we still are working with them. We meet with them every month. We keep him engaged. We're going to say, hey, Moose, we're going to add a new aspect to the BIA. And this is about privacy. We're going to have these questions. So it's okay, because we're always changing the BIA. The BIA is not a static thing. It's a changing document. We add this new, these new risk components to the BIA. And now we have an ongoing, sustainable annual risk assessment focused on a specific control. And we can do this for any control we want, for any risk area. The next thing is the planning. That's another thing that resiliency does extremely well. We've done it for 30 years. We do strategic recovery plans, and we drill into those plans, and we try to think of different aspects of it, because to us, it's not just about doing the plan, it's about doing it right, making sure that they are good plans for recovery. Well, we could also do that for mitigation. When we find a gap, okay, this is my experience, it might not be global, but I have found when a gap is found in my area, the GRC or the risk people will come and say, we want to know 3 things from you. Do you have a plan? When's it going to be done? And who owns it? That's all they care about. And then I say, okay, yeah, I own it. It'll be done in a year. They come back in a year. Is it done? Yeah. Then check. So what we want to do is come in, because a lot of times, let's say you're talking to someone in finance, and they have some kind of privacy gap. They might not be the best person to figure out how to address that gap. With the risk liaison, we can go down using our network of business risk managers. We can go down and help that person build a mitigation plan that's actually effective. And how do we know it's effective? Well, we're really good at doing validation exercises also. So after they create that plan, we do 1 hour validation exercise. We do tabletops for our plans. We've done them so many times, we can just sit down with somebody and run through a tabletop or a validation and get it done. We can do the same thing with these mitigation plans. So those are the 2 kind of aspects we take to address that resiliency piece. Now, what this does is a kind of mutual assistance thing. They're helping us. When I say they're, I'm talking about risk areas. Risk areas are helping us, and we're helping them. So how do they help us? Well, again, we want to be available. We don't want to be recoverable. We want to be available. So by identifying these risks before they're before they're manifested in some kind of impact, we use the expertise of the operational risk providers. We use these liaisons. We identify these risks. We mitigate these risks before anything happens. That is kind of how they can help us. We can help the operational risk areas by being what I call an operational risk service provider. Let's say there's a new law about a certain set of data, and this law says we need to understand everybody that has access to this data, the level of data they have they been trained, and shut off their access if they don't have the appropriate reason, justification for that. Well, if this data is being propagated, like in many companies, through applications, through spreadsheets, through reports, it's very difficult to find out who has access to this data. What we can do through our network is this service provider thing, is we can go to our business risk managers and ask them to do an assessment. And within a week, I can push this down and get the response back. In another week, I can push down training and get that back. So we can do things at a much more granular level than a lot of, actually, I think we can do it better than most groups in an organization, both sustainably and to the detail that we do it at. So that is how we can assist with the operational risk areas. We can actually be a service provider. Other examples of that would be, like I said, in the BIA. How often do we hire Deloitte or PwC to come every 18 months and do, take a test a section of our departments for doing a risk assessment? Well, we could do that without any extra money, but we could do it comprehensively and we could do it sustainably every year. All this data can be rolled up into a single GRC tool and can be managed that way, and it's living data. So, conclusion. Well, there it is. So we have these 3 phases, and again, we are battling both the perceived and actual discrepancy between investment and return. When we are a recovery-based program, we are only important when there is a disruption, when we need to be recovered. That's the only time we have any value. However, when we are focused on availability, and especially when we're integrated with other risk areas and we could help each other out, we provide value every single day because we are helping keeping the business run on a daily basis, not only when there's some kind of disruption. So that is the presentation. I told you it was going to be fun. And I could sometimes with your clapping and laughing, I could barely get through it. But so this is our Q&A. Does anybody have any questions, comments? Yes. Mm-hmm.
So if you have VDI, Singularly Converted Technology infrastructure, if you have VDI and you are basically a cloud first, would that address the business resiliency issue?
Well, that's a great question, and most people think yes. It doesn't. It really doesn't. Of the outages recently I've been involved with, it was on AWS, and it had nothing to do with AWS. It had to do with the database that fed to AWS. So just because you have, well, there's a couple things. So that's a great question, and that's a magic box that executives like to put stuff in. Put it on the cloud, we're safe. You need to do things like a cloud assessment. How many geographic zones, or there's a lot of subscription issues that you may not, I've had VPs tell me, look, we're totally undersubscribed on AWS, but no one cares because we're in the cloud, so they think it's safe. But beyond that, there are so many more components to resiliency than just that layer, like the database, like I mentioned. So I think it's a huge improvement, makes my job so much easier because the recovery part of it is taken care of for the cloud piece, but it doesn't, it's not a magic silver bullet. Yes?
Seems there's also been problems in the last few years with cloud providers because we don't know where their servers are. And in some cases, those servers have been flooded, and the cloud providers did not have good recovery plan themselves, or they thought they had a good recovery plan, but their provider did not. So that's where the problem's been.
I can't emphasize that enough. The dependencies so often are overlooked. There's so many things that go, but they think, oh, it's in the cloud. The other thing is location. When you mention location, there's also political issues. We're running into issues in Europe especially where we are partitioned. And so that creates its own set of issues. I would say that the cloud has really helped us on a recovery perspective, but there's still a lot of, it almost hurts more in a way because people then turn a blind eye to a lot of things that they would have looked at if it wasn't in the cloud. So, 10 minutes. So yes?